I'm going to be talking to Professor David Wright, Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary, about a recent ABLAWG post that he published titled, Just Transition Friction Needs Interest-Based Negotiation. So welcome to the interview, Dave.
Thanks, Markham. Nice to be here.
Look, I want to do this interview in two parts. The first part is Alberta and the federal government are having this dispute over just transition legislation. So we want to talk about that, what the federal government has been doing in particular, and then we'll talk about what they should be doing, which is your area of expertise and what you mostly wrote the ABLAWG post on. And I think it's important context for viewers to know that there's been a just transition task force. I think it was struck in 2017 to deal with coal transition. In June of 2021, they issued a discussion paper on broader just transition legislation. And then the next month in July, they initiated an engagement and consultation process across the country. And my sources in Ottawa tell me that Alberta hasn't been much interested in engaging. And instead, they've been sniping politically at them in the media and so on instead. So I guess I'll put it to you this way. It takes two good faith actors to negotiate. And it looks to me from where I sit that the feds are being typical, good faith. They're doing what they always do with legislation. And Alberta, and particularly under Danielle Smith, Premier Danielle Smith, is being a bad faith actor. What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, the context is important, and you're right. This isn't a new concept. Just transition in general, it's been around for literally decades. It started from different labor union movements, primarily in the United States. It's newer in the climate change and decarbonization context, but not new. And the federal government has been telegraphing for a long time and trying to collaborate for a long time on this initiative. What's perhaps a little bit new is the federal government is trying to push an initiative of enacting just transition legislation. And so, as you say, that's been informed by this discussion paper that was released in 2021. Discussion went into April of 2022. And so there's been an attempt, you're right, by the federal government to have constructive, collaborative kind of problem solving conversations and negotiations in that way. And it's a bit surprising because this has been around for so long. There's no surprises here, but it is surprising that at this stage, Alberta has chosen to try to take a more confrontational, competitive, distributive is what we'd say in the negotiation context approach. I'm not sure I would characterize it as bad faith. And I did notice that, for example, Minister Wilkinson was quite charitable in saying, look, Danielle Smith is a new premier. Maybe she's getting up to speed on this matter. So that sort of signals, again, a willingness on the federal government to engage meaningfully and respectfully and constructively, and perhaps not so much on the Alberta side. There's certainly much more I could say, and much more I have said to my students to whom I teach negotiations.
Sure. Fair enough. And there's a lot of background and context to this story, because this attack on the just transition concept has come out of the oil and gas industry years ago. And it's a favorite of their advocates online, for instance. Just transition is meant to shut down oil and gas, phase it out, that sort of thing. So, but that's not why we're here. I would like to get you to explain how interest-based negotiations could actually lead to a satisfactory outcome in this issue.
Yeah, so just in a nutshell, interest-based negotiations is an approach to negotiations that's been advocated and recognized for a long time as an effective kind of off-the-shelf method to go behind positional bargaining, go behind these sort of pithy, punchy ways of articulating what one wants, to understand why a party wants something. And so the idea is that by gathering information, building that relationship, and understanding what other parties value, you can start to identify ways to grow the pie, to find win-win solution, and to also, though, identify both aligned interests, but also differing or conflicting interests, so that those can then also be managed and stick handled. In the present context, it's not even clear that there are actually there's much in the way of diverging interests between Alberta and Ottawa, other than sort of short-term political gain. And so in this context, if both sides were willing to engage in that kind of process, and I do understand, we get snippets that perhaps at the officials level, there is some constructive dialogue, and there certainly probably has been over the last couple of years. But at this point, we really need to see it at the political and leadership level. And there seems to be no sign of it at this point. I mean, I guess yeah, there's more to say about how the federal government is actually a little bit positional too. So, but I'll back to you for a minute.
And I think we should point out to readers that it's not uncommon, and it's been pointed out for the UCP government under Jason Kenney, and now we don't know quite yet how Danielle Smith's government is managing this. But under Kenney, Kenney would attack Trudeau all the time, while his ministers, and Energy Minister then Sonia Savage, for instance, were engaging in constructive conversations with their federal government equivalents. So this is, and this happens with other governments and other provinces. What seems to be happening here is that the political rhetoric on Alberta's side has ramped up, and maybe it appears that they may be engaging somewhat, but not as much as the Kenney government did. That's kind of what I'm hearing through the grapevine from my sources. Anyway, so what now do the parties, what should they do, and what should the federal government do?
Sure. Well, I mean, in a perfect world, both sides would sort of take a deep breath, engage at the highest levels, and say, "Look, here are our interests. Here's our impression of your interests," and then start to rebuild the relationship in a reciprocal way that identifies the common ground. I mean, the message, and the federal minister Wilkinson has been pretty good at saying, look, this is not something that we want to do to Alberta. It's something that we want Alberta to actually lead and structure around their interests. And so the invitation is there, and it seems like the federal government is sort of going to continue leaving that invitation out there. So I would hope that cooler heads will eventually prevail in the Alberta context to seize those opportunities. But there is an aspect of the federal approach that's still quite positional. So the federal government is saying, we want to pass just transition legislation. And there's two bits of that could be problematic, and that perhaps the federal government wants to soften on. One is legislation. It's not clear that what the federal government's interests cannot be satisfied by not legislating. They may be able to just use the federal spending power, their power to convene, their power to gather information to satisfy whatever interest they may have. And to the extent that's not possible, dialogue will reveal it, and then they can try to find common ground. The second part is just transition. And again, Minister Wilkinson has been pretty clear in saying, look, I don't love this term either. It's what we got. It's actually woven into the Paris Agreement, for example. It appears in the Liberal NDP Supply and Confidence Agreement. So it's there, but it's there because it's actually quite a succinct way to communicate a concept that can take many more words than two. And so the federal government, though, may want to move away from that terminology and say, look, we don't need to legislate. Let's figure out a way to do this without legislation. We also don't need to call it this. And together we can find a way forward. So that may be a way for the federal government to take another sort of good faith constructive step.
Yeah, and you can see how the federal government could do that, Dave, because just transition in its most basic form is helping workers who are displaced by technological change, market change, and so on. Help them to retrain or to upskill and find other jobs. Might be in clean energy, it might be in something else, but give them, and also communities. That's another important aspect of this. But the federal government has all of the legislative authority, and it has spending power. It could literally do that without legislation, as you pointed out. And I suppose legislation might clarify a few things, but what would legislation provide? What could legislation provide that simply using spending powers and other powers couldn't do?
Well, my cynical response would be a nice headline that is attractive to people who vote in favor of such things. It's actually not that clear to me, Markham, why legislation would be necessary in this context. And again, from a negotiations perspective, that just means this zone of possible agreement between Alberta and Canada is enormous. There are many paths to Rome, if you will, especially in the present context. You have the Inflation Reduction Act in the US that is trying to do similar things. So there are lots of off-the-shelf historical examples of just transition, be it in coal or other sectors over the decades that can be followed. And then you add to that the clear opportunities when it comes to critical minerals, transmission build out, renewables, energy efficiency, and the list goes on. So there's really limitless ways to grow the pie in this context. And again, subject to further research that I do plan on doing, it's not totally clear to me why legislation is needed. And we may see, even though there's been inertia with the discussion paper and these sort of commitments to legislate, it'll be interesting to see if the federal government decides to soften on that and try to achieve it through other ends. Try to satisfy their interests through other means.
Last week, NDP leader Rachel Notley called on federal government to suspend its federal legislation till after the Alberta election, which, is not likely to happen from just because it's inconvenient for Alberta politicians right now. And I called, and frankly, I called on her in a column to defend just transition, or the idea of helping workers more, and she should lead that conversation as a member of the leader of the New Democratic Party. But given the context of our conversation, maybe her call to suspend the federal legislation pending rethinking the approach, maybe that's not a bad idea.
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I defer to the political scientists on such things, but there's certainly there's a whole universe of political interests circulating here, orbiting here, and there's a lot of conjecture about what means. I mean, one way to interpret that would be, look, we have hopes that we'll be elected come May, and we would like to be the ones who take the steering wheel from the federal government or with the federal government and try to direct it. But again, I think a lot of this circulates around or flows from problems with the terminology. And so it's hard to say what the NDP is thinking, but it seems like that they too see that just transition as a loaded term that's a lightning rod that's problematic for the electorate. It just comes back to the same point. Okay, fine, those words don't have to be those words, subject to the Paris Agreement and Supply and Confidence Agreement. But again, there's, Paris Agreement defers to sovereignty of any given nation in the pathways they choose. You don't have to call it just transition. And the Supply and Confidence Agreement, I would think the Liberals and NDP could just say, look, we're going to do this, we're just not going to call it. And I can't imagine that could implode that agreement. But no doubt that there are many political whirlpools swirling at the moment, and it's hard to see where this will go. But from a legal perspective, there are virtually limitless options on how to move forward.
Well, I'm going to, for viewers, I'm going to provide the link to Dave's blog post in the YouTube description, so you'll be able to find it there. And I'd encourage you to read it, because there's a lot of really more detailed information on how the party should conduct this negotiation. And Dave, thank you for doing this. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Markham. Take care.